My 16-year-old son Matthew once asked my 89-year-old father, "What's it like growing up, Grandad?" He said, "Very hard, always hungry." So this story was dictated in 2004 over the 4 days of the Easter holidays from my father. This is the place my father was born in. As was the custom at the time, an illegitimate child was put with a sibling family. In this case, his mother's brother Henry. He had a family now of 3 children. His stepsister Anne, who was the eldest, himself, and a younger brother George. It was quite a small family of 3 for that time. My father didn't know that cousin Elsie, who lived across the street, he wasn't allowed to see her, but what he didn't realise it was actually his mother. When they went to Australia years later, my mother went with him to see her, and she said it was a very strained conversation and uneventful. Scarborough in the 20s and 30s was a holiday town that billed itself as this place to come and spend your money, or what little you had. So they built it like this. It looked pretty packed like this, but my father and his brothers and sisters, they found it was like this. He said, in the house we bathed once a week on a Saturday afternoon. A large bucket was used. We would light a fire and heat the water, then pour it in. The toilet was an outhouse shared with 4 buildings. Once a week, a dunny carter would come and tip them out. The coal carrier would come once a week. We burned coal to keep warm. Uncle Ted would time himself to take a load of coal from the cart and not pay for it. His side of the family ended up with a history of crime. It appears that my father's life was school during the weekdays, every afternoon worked at a job, paid at least half the rent for his family, and he worked on a Saturday for money for himself, and all-day church on Sunday to purge the Catholicism out of him. He didn't know that at the time. It was a far cry from my own and my son's upbringing. I have a recollection of my mum, and she was asking me to do some work, and my father said, "Let him play. He's got time enough. He'll have to work soon enough." And in hindsight, I think he was remembering when he had to work so hard as a kid, and he thought his kid shouldn't have to do that. One thing that seems positive from this harsh upbringing was he's well equipped to survive the war in Burma. The hardships he grew up with as a child in England were a bit of a training ground actually to survive in Asia, and in his squadron, most people didn't. An uncle of mine worked in the gas company. Every night he would walk the streets and use a long stick to turn on the pilot light and turn the gas street light on. I would climb the pole and turn them back off again. One night I was climbing down a lamp pole and a policeman wrapped my legs with his arm guards. He said he wouldn't drag me home as he knew his father would beat me. So he made me climb them all again and turn them back on again. During the winter of 1938, old Corbett and I did a re-roofing job on the soldiers' quarters at the local army barracks. Old Corbett being the mate with whom I did my apprenticeship. I had just bought my first push bike for 5 shillings. The only thing wrong with it was the chain. It stretched and would not stay on the sprocket. That week my pay was raised to 24 shillings. 20 of that went to my step-parents for food and board, leaving me with 4 shillings with which I had to buy my clothes. Fortunately for me, I had another job delivering newspapers. They paid me a shilling for that. I got another chain for my bike, enabling me to get around better. My friend Len Richardson was a really good friend from school days, who was now a painter and decorator. He told me his mother had taken in visitors for money. Len had given up his bedroom to oblige her, and now he was camping at Burnston. He asked me if I'd like to do the same. All that year, from July to the end of September, we camped out. We were lucky it rained very little that year. All went well. We camped out again the next year. only this time, instead of sleeping on the floor or on ground sheets, Len's father got us beds and a much bigger tent, which was good because it rained a lot that year. The rain running right through the tent. We dug trenches around the sides and always checked to make sure the trench was clear before leaving for work that morning. Second week in September, we packed up, never to do that again. War was declared on Germany. Len's father, being an ex-Navy man, wanted him to volunteer. When he did, he was called up in 1940. Len liked boats. I think he would like to have been a fisherman, but his mother stopped him, maybe because Len's father, being a Navy man, was at sea all the time. 2 bricklayers, 2 carpenters and I went to North Bay, our job being to supervise the army, who were building pillboxes and tank traps. There were hundreds of soldiers. All we did was see the timber and was fixed properly, and that the aggregate for the concrete was right. It was very cold, standing not doing anything. My father's boss, this guy he worked for, named John Durham, it looks like he was giving him jobs trying to get him to join the army, and eventually he got pretty sick of that. And then he said, next morning, Dad told me the man from St. John's Barracks had been around and wanted me to join the army. I did not wish to join the army. I went to see John Durham and he said, you're too young for the reserve occupation. So I said to him, I'll take the day off and I'll join the Air Force. He said, I can't stop you from doing that. I went off to the Liberal Club, where the Air Force recruiting office was located, had a medical examination and signed up. 1 week later, a letter came from the Air Force recruiting office advising me to report to Queen Street Recruiting Office, Edinburgh, at 12:30 p.m, 9th of September 1940. That day, I took the first train out of Scarborough to York, and then York to Edinburgh. I got there a little late, but no one seemed to mind. A man from in the Air Force uniform ushered me into a room and said, take a seat and wait till your name's called. There was about 15 or 20 lads in the room, all about my age. I took a seat next to a young fellow. He started to talk to me. After about 10 minutes, I found out he came from the Orkney Islands. He spoke so fast in a mixture of Gaelic and English, I didn't have a hope of understanding him. My name was called. I was shown into a room with an officer behind the desk. We shook hands. He asked me how I became a tiler and slater. I said, at the time I left school, it was the only apprenticeship job available. It was hard to tell what he made of that, my answer. He picked up a book and said, when I flick the pages, tell me what numbers you see. Not having seen anything like that before, the pages were a mass of dots and colours. The numbers came out 5, 7, 3, 8, 6. Then he said, write an essay, 50 words or less, why the Suez Canal was so important to England. All I wrote was, it's the shortest route from the Far East to get oil and rubber back to England. When I went back home, I was walking along and Jerry came down and he dropped some bombs near the harbour behind the pier. Aunt Esther lived behind the pier and her husband was a fisherman. Quite a number of houses were damaged. Hers had the windows blown in and the roof off. They were lucky they didn't get hurt. Uncle Jim lost his fishing lines and nets, but his boat in the harbour was all right. They moved out of town just down Seamer Road near the gasworks. We were kept busy doing repairs to the houses. About 2 months after, Corbett and I were going up Cliff Street to repair a house. We were halfway across the Valley Bridge when a Jerry plane came over about 500 feet above our head. We could see the markings on the wings and the guns in the tail. He flew up the valley and dropped bombs on the gasworks, damaging Aunt Esther's house again. She moved back into the house near the harbour. 4th of September 1941, a letter came from the Air Force advising, report to Padgate Recruitment Centre. On the 9th of September, John Durham was not a happy man. He was making a lot of money repairing bomb damage. Left Scarborough at 6 o'clock in the morning train. Arrived Padgate Station about 11 o'clock. There was around 300 lads my age on the platform, and the Air Force officer told us to go outside the station and board the buses for the recruitment centre. The recruiting centre, we were divided up into squads of about 30. Then they put us into long huts with narrow beds. We sat on a bed each. Then a corporal came and took our name and number. Then he took us to the cookhouse and we had sandwiches and cake for tea. That done, we lined up outside, and then there's another long hut. We went through the door and there was a long counter. Must have been 100 yards long, with a man every yard behind it. Then it started. First you got your kit bag, then they asked you how tall you were. Then when you told them how tall you were, you got a jacket and trousers and top coat. Then you give them your size of collar, then they give you a shirt, vest and underpants. Then they ask you the size of boots and you get boots and socks, blacking brushes and a brass plate and a brush to clean your buttons and cap badge and a toothbrush. Lastly, we got a housewife, which was a hold-all with needle and cotton, grey wool and darning for darning socks and sewing buttons on. All this was done at walking pace. Then they gave us 2 packs and a webbing belt and a water bottle. At the end of the row, the corporal said, go to your hut and put them on. If something doesn't fit, bring it back and exchange it. We got dressed in the Air Force uniform. An Air Force corporal advised us on how to do it. Had to interchange sizes to save messing about before we got back to the counter to exchange. They packed up our civilian clothes in boxes. We put our name and address on them, and it was delivered back to our house. We put the pack on and the webbing together on the belt. Packed excessive clothes into a kit bag and were taken to the cookhouse for a meal. That night we got on a train for Great Yarmouth, taken by bus to residences on the seafront. We were split into 30 and allocated a bed. And that's when the training began.